Mark's Gospel is similar to other classical biographies, which don't identify their author's name in their accounts. Plato and Xenophon, for example, don't identify themselves as the authors of their Socratic apologies. Of course, there were a variety of other ways an author could attach their name to a text, such as in a title or on a flyleaf. So it could be that Plato, Xenophon, and even Mark added their names to their original publications in one of these other ways. All the early manuscripts of Mark's Gospel attribute the authorship to Mark. Not a single copy has an anonymous title, and not a single copy attributes the book to a different author. By contrast, the letter to the Hebrews is another New Testament book where no author is named in the text. Accordingly, we have early manuscripts with anonymous titles, and early fathers attribute the letter to as many as 4 different authors. But there's no parallel to this authorial anonymity or diversity for Mark's Gospel. In fact, all of the earliest fathers who comment on the Gospel's authorship attribute the writing to Mark. Furthermore, these 1st and 2nd century fathers hail from disparate provinces scattered around the Roman Empire. Papias from Asia Minor, Clement of Alexandria from Egypt, Tertullian from Carthage, and Irenaeus from Gallia. North, south, east, and west, all are represented. The earliest and most valuable witness to the authorship of Mark's Gospel comes from John the Elder, an original disciple of Jesus. John's testimony was provided to his contemporary Papias in the latter quarter of the 1st century. Interestingly, John's testimony is not focused on identifying Mark as the author of the Gospel as if it was unknown or unclear. Rather, it's the known fact of Mark's authorship that calls for John's response in the first place. You see, John was an original hearer of Jesus, and Mark wasn't. So why would John promote or defend the use of Mark's Gospel? John's answer is that since Mark was Peter's translator, he had both heard and repeated Peter's accounts about Jesus' sayings and deeds. So John didn't view Mark's Gospel as anything other than an accurate record of Peter's stories. And who better to make such a judgment than an original hearer of Jesus and a companion of Peter's? For this reason, it's noteworthy that Justin Martyr, in the middle of the 2nd century, describes Mark's Gospel as Peter's memoir. Whether one accepts John's testimony as true or not, the record shows that Mark's authorship was already assumed in the latter quarter of the 1st century by an original disciple of Jesus who obviously was esteemed enough to offer a highly sought-after commendation of his younger contemporary's record of Jesus' ministry. Now, it's not clear to me why a modern scholar might think they would know better than John the Elder about Mark's authorship or his accuracy. After all, Mark grew up in Jerusalem shortly after the ministry of Jesus, and his family knew the apostles. He had traveled with Paul and his relative Barnabas in Asia Minor, and eventually was attached to Peter as his translator in Rome, presumably. Since Mark was from a Judean priestly class, he was most likely literate. Though Greek was probably not his first language, a majority of Jerusalemites appear to have been trilingual, knowing Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. Josephus says even slaves in Judea could easily learn Greek if they wanted to. A literate Judean Christian like Mark, writing in Greek as a second language, certainly helps to explain why Mark's Greek is competent but hardly impressive compared to classical biographies, especially since this gospel appears to be Mark's only major composition, and John the Elder insinuates that it showed in its lack of order. It nearly goes without saying that the elder John would have had less work to do if Mark's gospel had simply been attributed to Peter. But it seems in this respect the Christians were transparent about its true authorship, even though it required an additional layer of explanation in defense of its accuracy. All this evidence suggests there's no good reason to seriously doubt the significant positive evidence for Mark's authorship of the Gospel. Our earliest certification of Mark's writing comes from a contemporary of Mark who was both older and more esteemed as an original disciple. The later fathers unanimously confirm this earlier witness, even though it's clear they weren't all relying upon this one source. By contrast, the classical work known as the Anabasis of Alexander has much weaker external evidence in its favor, and yet no scholar I'm aware of is skeptical of Arrian's authorship. If some biblical scholars remain skeptical of Mark's authorship, they can't blame this classicist, at least, for not being persuaded of their skepticism.